Hello, thank you for coming. My name's Rhys Powell. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester, and my paper concerns the practice of associational power among food delivery platform couriers in the UK. Specifically, I identify some of the diverse associational forms which have emerged through platform couriers' struggles over the last 5 years, and ask whether they have posed a challenge to the established trade union form as a means of pursuing couriers' interests. My data for this comes from some initial research that I conducted in early 2020, beginning with participant observation prior to the coronavirus pandemic, and followed by in-depth remote interviews with couriers and organisers who had taken part in several diverse organising efforts in England, Wales and Scotland. I also conducted content analysis of written first-person accounts of couriers' collective action. 3 non-union associational forms emerged from this, and today I'll draw some preliminary conclusions on their implications for worker organising in platforms. Firstly, however, I want to explain what I mean by the union form. International and contextual diversity makes it difficult to identify a single, all-encompassing model union. Instead, varieties of trade unionism must be understood in their historical context. In the UK, that is a context of post-war institutionalisation and of highly effective legislative attack from the late 1960s onwards. The result is a broadly standard model of unionism, which largely conforms to the strict conditions laid out by the state. For example, in order to be registered with a certification officer and recognised as an independent representative body, unions must adopt a particular internal structure of fee-paying membership and a hierarchy of officers, something which may seem self-evident, but is antithetical to more radical syndicalist traditions. This serves to make the union more easily recognisable in its internal structures, and thus open to sanctions by the state or employers. Regulations surrounding strike action are particularly strict, and unions run the risk of injunctions and the sequestration of assets, alongside brute force from the state, if action is deemed unlawful. This in turn produces the need for an increased bureaucracy, for strict internal regulation of workers' action, and a general aversion to risk. A host of new unions have emerged since 2012, focused on organising precarious workers and claiming to fill the gaps left by the risk aversion of established unions. The Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain, the IWGB, was the first of these, emerging partly from a conflict with Unison, and making claims to more authentic forms of worker representation. Since its intervention in a 2016 Deliveroo strike, the IWGB has emerged as the most recognisable representative of platform couriers. And while the IWGB is innovative in many ways, it is important to recognise that it ultimately fits the standard British union form. For example, since its formation, it has developed a large body of paid professional staff. It has sought and won a number of recognition agreements with employers, and it has directed significant time and resources at campaigning through the state. This research tries to look beyond this particular form to potential challenges. The first alternative is what I label communities of struggle, borrowing a concept from Davida Perot's research on migrant workers in London. These combine coping mechanisms in precarious circumstances with efforts at changing those circumstances through collective action. They are visible as local, interpersonal networks of couriers, which tend to exist both in person and digitally, formed through interactions while waiting for orders, and sustained through collective mobile communications, facilitated by the platform's requirement that workers have a smartphone. One of the first known strikes among Deliveroo couriers in London in 2016 exemplifies the significance of these communities. In response to the threat of imposing piece rate pay, couriers organised a strike rally outside Deliveroo's headquarters through interpersonal and digital networks. A participant spoke of how his knowledge of that strike came from a WhatsApp video shared with him by a friend, which led to him attending the rally and becoming further involved in organising efforts. Another participant in Liverpool spoke of his experience as a relatively isolated migrant who became embedded in the courier community through Facebook groups. And Callum Cant writes of such communities as channels of invisible organising, mutual support and agitation. We might understand these as products of the platform labour process, where periods of relative autonomy between orders combine with the latent need for cooperation and skill sharing between couriers. But at the same time, it is important to recognise that they can sometimes be built on the back of other pre-existing social ties, such as migrant identities. The result can be cooperation between different social groups, but it can also be fragmentation. Recounting a 2018 Uber Eats strike in London, an anonymous courier writes that there were many WhatsApp groups, divided into nationalities and areas, but there was no coordination, so it was quite chaotic. In many cases, coordination emerged through unionisation efforts. The 2016 strike, whilst initially self-organised by such a community, saw the IWGB intervene and establish itself as a representative of the struggle. Similarly, a participant in York spoke of the importance of agitating an existing WhatsApp group as his first step to building the union in the city. It is subsequently tempting to view couriers' communities exclusively in these terms as the basis for unionisation, and while that has often been the case, I argue that we might understand such communities as more than just the embryonic basis of more recognisable organisations, but as constitutive and dynamic elements of platform courier struggles with the potential to act as alternatives to unions. In multiple instances, collective action organised through such communities has not resulted in unionisation. Strikes in Birmingham in January of 2019 and in Newcastle in September of the same year are both examples of isolated actions which were not led by unions and did not result in unionisation. Instead, they were organised by invisible associations of couriers, which existed over long periods of time, occasionally taking visible action, only to dissipate or retreat to focus on day-to-day coping mechanisms. Their self-activity, without organisational structures being imposed, distinguishes them from the union form, and their militancy put pressure on established unions, with one organiser describing how they were left trying to cling on to the tiger's tail, aiming to reflect the levels of anger felt amongst workers. Turning to my second related example, the Industrial Workers of the World Couriers Network sought to coordinate those communities without imposing union structures. The IWW, of course, has a long history as an international revolutionary union, closely associated with an anarcho-syndicalist politics, and it is a registered trade union in the UK. But in its efforts at platform organising between 2018 and 19, it adopted a distinctive organisational structure which sought to synthesise elements of the union form with workers' self-activity. Pre-existing IWW branches would aim to access courier communities, identify grievances, and facilitate action. Crucially, couriers were not required to formally join the union to fully participate in the network's activities, and while efforts were made to create UK-wide structures, these were often ignored by branches, who instead organised locally through WhatsApp groups and open meetings. This open model represented a desire to reflect and respond to the novel, flexible and individualised nature of platform labour in innovative ways, turning the logic of the gig economy on itself, as an organiser wrote. It also reflected the politics of the IWW, which entails seeking to organise the class rather than building the union for its own sake, facilitating self-activity as opposed to managing action from above. That syndicalist politics is also visible in the network's refusal to work with or through the state. While the IWGB were pursuing legal action against self-employed status, the network made a point of not doing this, responding to participants' preferences to focus on day-to-day issues. This attentiveness allowed for tactical flexibility and experimentation, which included targeting specific restaurants and seeking media attention when couriers were unfairly terminated by platforms. However, the lack of responsiveness from platform companies meant that strike action was often the network's go-to tactic, a heavy reliance which would prove problematic. While non-courier IWW organisers saw strikes as a means of increasing participation and militancy, a participant noted that couriers often had high expectations of success following a single strike, and that enthusiasm could be severely damaged when change was not the immediate outcome. Other issues arose surrounding the disconnect between the IWW and courier communities. There was often skepticism towards the network as an outside body, and this was not entirely unfounded. A participant noted that the network came to largely rely on 3 organisers, only one of whom was a courier, and that their burnout led to its ultimate collapse. This seems to have been facilitated by the lack of formal processes through which couriers could be integrated into the network's organising efforts. And while that same lack of flexibility, same lack of formality, can be said to have provided tactical flexibility, it can also be said to have ultimately led to the network's demise. My third example shares the desire to reflect and subvert platform logic, but takes a very different form. Multiple courier cooperatives exist in the UK, and my research looked specifically at the York Collective, which is made up of current or former platform couriers, aiming to adopt the platform role as a digital mediator between consumers and business. A participant spoke of this as mimicking what's already been done by private companies, but with a democratic and participative business model and an aim to pay secure wages. In a context where an estimated 80% of on-demand food delivery takes place through established platforms, cooperatives face enormous challenges. My participant spoke of the collective's reliance on ethical consumption practices, particularly on a willingness to pay more for delivery based on a sense of fairness for workers. This led to difficulties, such as getting restaurants to use their service when faced with competitive offers from other platforms, and around coordination and designing tech without significant funding. Nonetheless, the York Collective continues to operate and has solidified its ethical image through delivering donated meals to NHS workers during the pandemic. As a form of collective action, co-ops have been critiqued as deeply contradictory, seeking to combine prefigurative activism with entrepreneurship and democracy with the despotism of the market. While one participant saw involvement in the collective as complementary to union organising, with each aiming to improve couriers' immediate conditions, another offers a convincing critique, saying that courier co-ops take people who would be great organisers and protect their own. They acknowledge that they're not actually challenging things, they're carving out their niche. That's actually quite dangerous. What they're saying is that this model will always exist. It will always rely on exploitation. Therefore, we need to carve out our niche to protect ourselves. And it is correct to note that while courier co-ops have improved conditions for the small numbers involved in them, they are yet to go beyond those limited contexts or present any substantial threat to platform couriers' working conditions overall. So based on this preliminary research, I'm left to conclude that no effective challenge to the union form has emerged so far among platform couriers in the UK, suggesting that unionism has proved a resilient conduit for collective action, even in the restrictive context of British labour law and the ostensibly novel context of platform labour. As I record this, the IWGB is preparing for a UK-wide strike as Deliveroo launches on the London Stock Exchange. From the beginning of its platform organising efforts, the union has built structures which integrate a diverse range of couriers into local and national activities, and it has drawn public and political attention to platform working conditions through its sophisticated organising apparatus. Non-union activities have remained largely confined to local and often isolated levels. Efforts to adopt and subvert the flexible logic of platform labour have resulted in fragmentary and often unsustainable initiatives, suggesting that it may be more effective to impose the regimented logic of organised labour on non-standard work. This is not to say that non-union organisational forms hold no strategic value, or that our attention as researchers should remain fixed exclusively on unions. The restrictive nature of the union form must still be kept in mind, and workers' self-activity provides a potential means of continuously challenging that through wildcat action, even if such challenges are yet to prove fundamental. Thank you.